Hi, this is Greg Hughes from 90-Second Website Builder. One of the advantages of working with layout grids in this software is that it will do a lot of the thinking for you when it comes to building responsive websites. In other words, layout grids make it possible for you to make a responsive page without having to make breakpoints and page variations. So it kind of does most of the thinking for you when you're doing some design. I'll show you what I mean. On this page, I'm looking at these two layout grids. They're both set exactly the same. And when I click F5 to preview this, it'll demonstrate my point. So let me scroll down to that part of the page, and you'll see I have these two layout grids. Each one has an image, text, and button. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the size of the browser. Let me get it more into the camera so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to reduce the size of the browser, and you'll see that as I do, the page is responding. In other words, it's responding to what it would look like on a mobile device. And that's why the images are scaling down, and that's why the text is shifting and the button gets pushed down accordingly. And if we go wider, so do the pictures. They expand or increase in size, and the text stretches out accordingly. So this is a really great advantage, and the number one reason you'd want to design with layout grids, because it does this thinking for you. But one of the problems when technology does thinking for you, it means you have less control over the layout or the design of your website, because you're letting the device decide, or you're letting the software make that decision for you. If you were making breakpoints and page variations, it's a lot more work, but you'd have control over exactly how big this image should be at each page variation. It's just a lot more work. So I'm going to show you the best of both worlds. You actually do have more control with a layout grid than you may think. And I'll explain that by showing you 3 different techniques in layout grids that will help you. The first thing we need to know about is how the image is scaling. Notice the images were going up and down in size, or increasing dimension when we increase the width of the browser window, and that's because of a very simple setting. Now I'm going to take this image and take it out of the grid for a minute, and I'm going to move the camera, and we're going to look at this image. By double-clicking on it, we'll look at its properties. If you've done this before, you'll be familiar with this window, and you'll see that, yeah, this has all the properties it should have for an image. I want you to look at this blank space down here and notice this, because what happens is whenever we put an image inside a grid, which I'm about to do, put this in here, move the camera over. I'm going to double click on this image now and look at the properties, and you'll notice that it picked up a new configuration possibility right here under layout. What happens is this is the option that makes this image scale. We've set this to full width true, and that's why this image scales. I'll show you what I mean. If we were to turn this off or set it to false, click OK, F5 to preview it in a browser, you'll see a huge difference. And this alone may help some of you if you're having difficulty with your images not scaling. This is why. So notice that this image is set to false, the one below it is set to true, and we'll make the comparison as we change the browser width. Look what's happening to the top image. It's not scaling at all. All it did was shift over, but it didn't change in dimension. That's not what you want. You don't want this overlap. So that's a simple fix if you're running into a problem and wondering why your images aren't scaling. That's very likely why. So let's go back and fix that. All I'm going to do is double click on this, set this to true, and now we're good to go. Let's double check it just for the sake of clarity. Scroll down to that, and you can see now it's scaling as it should. Okay, that's simple. But that's one trick, and I told you I'm going to show you 3 of them. This time we're not going to look at the image settings, we're going to look at the grid itself. So I'm going to double click on this layout grid. Remember, when we're in the layout grid settings, when I'm on this page, I'm looking at the settings for the entire grid, not the settings for any single column. So this applies to the whole grid, everything in it, no matter what column it's in. If I wanted to edit a single column, I could select this and click edit, or I could double click on the column and go there. But this is going to apply to the entire grid. And here's 2 things I want to point out. First of all, we're going to look at breakpoint, and we're going to look at maximum width. We're going to talk about maximum width first. You'll notice that this is set to 1140. That's 1140 pixels wide, as in the width of the page. Now, my page is set to be around 970 pixels. So this is bigger than my page width. There's a reason for that, and I'll show you in a minute. So let's watch what happens. Let's go back to our browser and preview this. And this time, instead of looking at what happens when we reduce the browser, I want you to see what happens when we increase the browser, because that's what this setting is about. So here we have our image. Again, it's reducing or scaling down as necessary. What happens when I increase the size of the browser past my 970 pixel website? See, my website here, I've only set for 970. So what happens past 970? Well, not much, because what I told this image to do, no, let me rephrase that. What I told this layout grid to do, which applies to the image and the text, is I said, I want you to max out at 1140 pixels. You can stop increasing your size or adjusting yourself, so to speak, once we get to 1140. Why? Well, because my page is only set for 970 anyway. Anyone that has a screen size 1140, that's a pretty big monitor. Most people aren't going to go much higher than 1200 pixels. So I'm just saying that by the time you get to 1140, you're done changing your dimension. So to explain that or demonstrate that better, let's go in and change the number. This time I'm going to exaggerate this, and let's make this number smaller. In fact, let's make it really small just to make the point. I'm going to say 320. You would never do this, but again, this is to show you what this maximum width feature does. I'm going to set this at 320. In other words, I'm telling the software, I'm telling the page, you can stay the size you would be for 320 the whole time. You don't need to ever get any bigger than a 320 breakpoint. That's not true, of course. I don't want to do that, but I am going to demonstrate it so you can see what happens when I do that. Look at that. So here's my grid now, and it's doing exactly what I said. The grid, if it had a personality, it would say, hey, you told me not to get any bigger than what I need for a 320. So that's what we're doing. It's a maximum width of 320. The one below it, set for 1140. So as I decrease this size, this one's still behaving as I told it to. It's still staying at 320 no matter how big I go. It's maxed out at a 320 breakpoint. Hope that makes sense. So let's try something else now. This time, let's set it for a much bigger number. We had it at 1140. Let's set it for, say, 2000. Most people don't have a 2000 pixel monitor, but let's just set it for that. So I'm going to say OK. And now, as we preview, I'm clicking F5 again to preview. Scroll down the page to get to these. You'll notice something right off the bat. You'll notice that this image is already bigger than the one below it. Remember, the layout grid below is set to 1140. This layout grid, not just the image, but the layout grid is set to a maximum width of 2000, which means it can keep scaling up as we stretch the browser. And I realize I'm off camera here, but I'm stretching the browser way past the 1140, past the 970, way past the 1140, and even on the way out to all the way out to 2000. And you'll see what happens is that's when it stops adjusting. Because I said when you get to 2000, you can just stay right there. And that's why this image is bigger, because it kept growing as the browser width did. Unlike this one knew to stop as soon as we got to 1140. We decided that's plenty big enough. And that normally would be. I would never make this be 2000. You're going to want to stick to numbers like 1200 or something like that. I'm making these exaggerated numbers so you can see how the software responds. Now, if you wanted to use 2000, that's fine. If you think people are going to be looking at your website on big monitors, that's great. It's not going to hurt anything because people on smaller monitors are still going to see it accordingly. So that's fine to go bigger. In this case, though, I'd probably want to make sure all of my layout grids are set to 2000, so these images stay the same size. I don't want one being bigger than the other one in a different monitor. So I would change them all to the same is the point. Anyway, let's go back, close this down, and let's set this. I still like 1140 or 1200 or whatever, and we'll keep it at that. So now everything is working the same. But there was one other thing. I showed you, first of all, the full width set to true. That's important, so things scale. I also showed you the maximum width right here for the layout grid. There's something else we were telling the layout grid, and that's the breakpoint. Before I tell you what the breakpoint does, let me show you what it does, because we've been looking at it to a certain point, and you may or may not have noticed. Here's what the breakpoint's doing for us. Notice that when we were scaling down, and let's get them both in the window here. When we're scaling down, you'll notice that the image is right next to the text. They're in this horizontal layout. We're using a layout grid that's smart enough to know that we want this image next to the text and the button under that. But what happens is I told the software at 480, I want you to make a change. Watch what that change is. As I scale down and I get closer to the 480, we're still next to each other. We're still horizontal, but at 480 is my breakpoint, and all of a sudden, boom, we just switched to a vertical layout, which is much smarter. It looks better. If we were really on a device 480, this would look better than this. So I told the software, if somebody's looking at this on a 480 or smaller, I want you to switch to a different layout. I want you to do this kind of a layout. And that's where the breakpoint number is really, really helpful. So again, let's exaggerate it so you can see what's happening. I'm going to double click, and you can see I told it to break at 480. Now, if I set this to something bigger, let's say 800, watch what happens. We're going to F5, which is preview, scroll down the page here, and let's reduce the size of this page. And again, everything's responding fine, but remember the breakpoint in the upper layout grid is 800, and the one below it is still 480. Boom, there we go. So we got to 800, and it switched to this vertical layout. So I do have control over when that happens. So if someone was on a tablet, they would see it like this instead of like this. And I can mix and match. If I really wanted to just do that in this layout grid, I could. Obviously, it's up to you on how consistent you want to be. And, it depends on obviously the content of your website. But the point of this is that you have way more control over how these things act in a layout grid than you may have thought originally. So this is a really important one. So as I scroll down, this is still going to scale because it's set to do that. And notice the one below didn't switch to the vertical until it got to 480, which is right here. And now it's also doing the vertical like this one. But I do get to decide when that happens by using that. Okay, so hopefully that helps you. Again, you want to set your layout on the image that's inside a grid. Layout full width equals true. Inside the grid itself, you want to control the maximum width. And I would make sure, in this case, I want my grids to all be the same. Normally you would do that. And then I want to set the breakpoint to something sensible. Normally that's going to be 480, but you can decide. It's up to you. It's up to the quality of your image and the content of your website. But there's a lot of settings, obviously, in a layout grid. But I've just shown you these two important ones, plus the one in the image settings, which will help you control how your objects and how your content responds using layout grids in 90-Second Website Builder.